Welcome to the Ex-Foster Voice, where we represent the voices of those who have lived through the foster system. I'm Serena Vasudeva, ex-foster youth and your host. Today we'll be hearing from Dr. Harden, a professor in the Department of Social Work at Middle Tennessee State University. She worked for the Department of Human Services, now known as the Department of Children's Services. For someone who knows nothing about foster care, how would you describe it?
Ideally, it is a replacement for the family. It's designed to be a natural environment in which a child who can't live in their family of origin is able to live, have relationships much like family system relationships. Historically, we can think about this idea of fostering, frankly, as coming from orphanages way back many years ago. But as we realize that children need a better environment, they need attachment and nurturing, the idea of having almost proctor families or replacement families in some way came about with foster care, largely to help with children who had been in abusive situations or family systems that were unable to take care of them.
So foster care sort of started as a system with this attachment idea. Could you tell me more about that?
Sure. So we think about child attachment from the very first points of really pre-birth. But then as a child is born, there are things that happen between the caregiver and the child that help to build this idea of attachment. Ideally, that's happening whenever a child or an infant is getting their basic needs met. And we think early on about things like crying for food, crying because I'm hungry, crying because I need my diaper changed, crying possibly because I'm cold or need to be held. In a good situation, in a healthy situation, a child and caregiver are mutually attaching. The infant and the caregiver, let's say mother or father, maybe grandmother, are reciprocal in that attachment. Now, a lot of things break that attachment cycle or cause injury to it. Oftentimes, if a parent or caregiver is involved in substance use or addiction, has a mental health condition, has their own traumas that they haven't dealt with, that could break that attachment cycle. And over time, those kinds of breaks, so to speak, in attachment can help build these more unhealthy relationships between the parent and the child. Now, in the worst case scenario, that attachment is broken or cause problems too because of abuse. So if a child is being physically abused, sexually abused, or having a neglect situation, that's going to really affect the attachment. Ideally, in a foster care setting, you're putting that child in a situation where they can build that attachment again with someone and have a safe, nurturing environment that helps to repair those broken bonds, so to speak.
So what does attachment have to do with development?
We kind of consider the attachment process as integral to the development of a child. So think about cognitive development, we think about emotional development and physical development, frankly. There are a lot of things related to, for example, neglect that may affect the child's physical development, say malnutrition, for example. We also look at things related to how the child is able to emotionally regulate. Attachment helps that child to understand their environment, to trust their environment, and to know, oh, someone's going to feed me. So that reinforces that it's safe, I'm being cared for, I don't have to worry about this discomfort. As soon as I cry, someone takes care of it. In situations where that's not happening, that emotional regulation doesn't occur at the rate that it would in a healthy situation. So the child cries, nothing happens. The child cries again, no one's feeding them. Then the child is screaming and no one's feeding them. And in the worst case scenario, when a child's needs aren't being met, they shut down completely oftentimes. So they're not even interacting, they're not having eye contact, they're not reaching out for that adult because they can't predict that that's a safe relationship.
How does the foster system succeed and fail with the attachment cycle?
So generally speaking, foster parents are trained on the importance of attachment, but we also have to realize that children are attached to their birth families quite often, even in situations where it's not the healthiest. They still love their parents. They still love their caregivers, so to speak. And we move them into a setting with complete strangers, with people that they're then suddenly supposed to be a family with. And that's very difficult. Transferring attachment is not really what happens. You don't just say, okay, I can attach to this person. Now I'm naturally going to attach to this other person. It's a lot of work. And sometimes maybe foster parents aren't prepared for that level of work. The idea of a foster home is wonderful, and the idea that a child could go into a nurturing environment and easily and readily attach within that family system and build those bonds that are so important is an ideal situation. It's just unfortunately not always the reality, because the older the child gets, the more complicated and complex the attachment process becomes. And the longer they've been in a situation with these uneasy attachments or this inability to predict safety in their environment, the harder that whole process is as well.
How can the foster system prepare kids to enter homes that have different family systems than what they're used to? For example, I came from a single parent household. It was just me and my mom for 16 years. And then I went into foster care, and suddenly I had a quote unquote dad, right? I had a foster dad. And I hadn't, I didn't really have a relationship with my dad. And now suddenly I have this adult male in my life who's trying to tell me, oh, we should go to church and bond. And it's like, that was really awkward. So like, where do you come in with that? What do you think about it?
I think that's one of the trickiest and most complicated parts of being in foster care and being a foster parent. You come in with your own family culture, with your own ideas about family roles, and a foster parent has their ideas about family roles, like who's supposed to cook the meals, who is, cleaning the house, who doing these things. And a child or an adolescent comes into that home, and then I guess the idea is that they just take on those roles or understand how that family works, and then just sort of assimilates to that. And that's not the case. We're humans. We all have our own constructed reality of what we think, what we expect. And you're learning all of these new cultural sort of rules about that family on top of the loss that you've experienced and the grief and trauma from being removed from your family. And then the foster parent has these wonderful ideas about how they're going to help you and work with you and make sure that your life is better than it was. And then think about moving from one foster home to the other. And every single family system has its own culture, right? If you came from a family where there were no real rules and suddenly you're in a very rigid, hierarchical foster system or foster family, it's going to be a problem. You're going to have difficulty trying to work your way through that. So those add to the conflicts and the concerns. They also, unfortunately, add to displacement and partly why a lot of young people, a lot of children are placed multiple times before they really find that family system that fits well. And sometimes that unfortunately never really happens if they're trying to replicate the family they came from. Being a therapist, I'm a little bit biased probably to those processes, but I do think having a good clinician helping with that process of engaging with the family and the family's process of expectations, and having expectations that are not overwhelming but reasonable for a young person or a child coming into a foster home is really important. And your clinician can help navigate that. I also think that we need to all think about, this idea of unconditional positive regard and looking at the person for the human that they are and accepting them for who they are versus trying to mold them into something that we think they should be. That's a little bit harder said than done, but I also think it's really important that we try to start from that perspective. Did that kind of answer the question for you?
Yeah, I mean, you're saying stuff that I've been saying for literally years. The
Yeah.
worst part of the foster system, people sort of have this, they think that when you like are in foster care, the hardest part is this like, I don't have a family kind of thing. And for some people, that genuinely is the point of stress for them. But for me, it's like I was there and I was like, I can't find any houses that are even remotely like the one that I was in. And I get to these houses and, my first house, like they were like, oh, you can go take walks. And I was used to taking walks. That's all I did when I was with my mom. And then my fourth or fifth family, they were like, you can't leave the house. You can never leave the house unless you're going to school. And when you go to school, you come back from school. And it's like, there's already enough of a difference from going from your house to another person's house, let alone your house from another person's house to another person's house. And none of them are like yours. So thank you for bringing that up, because it's something that people don't really think about when you think about foster care. Everyone else wants you to change for them, but nobody tries to mimic what you feel comfortable with.
Right. I think you make a great point. For me, we put so much, I think, pressure and emphasis on the child making the change, the child's behavior, the adolescent's behavior. They need to conform to our rules. We have a curfew. We have this. They broke this rule. They broke that rule. And to me, that just adds so many layers to the trauma they're already experiencing. And it's not to say that people shouldn't have rules. I mean, we all need to have guideposts, right? And ways that we respond and interact. But at the same time, it's important that we respect where someone came from, because even in very problematic or difficult family systems, they're not all bad and they're not all good. Nobody's family is all bad or all good. There were good things that happened. There were maybe bad things that happened, maybe things that were out of your control as a young person, as a child, but not every single day, every moment was bad.
Yeah. And another issue that I've sort of come across as I was moving through the system was a lot of the times something would happen in the foster parents' past. There had been some sort of accident or some sort of incident where something really serious might have happened, like somebody ran away or something bad happened. But because of that bad instance, all the other kids after them have to follow a rule that was put in place for them. So for example, going back to running away, if one kid runs away or does something they're not supposed to do when they're outside, then nobody else is allowed to, take walks. Or if somebody goes online on the internet and does things that they're not supposed to be doing, nobody else after that kid, even years after that kid, is not allowed to use the internet anymore, even if it's just for listening to music or playing a game or talking to your friends. And that kind of seemed ridiculous to me.
That's really important. You live the legacy of the young people or the adolescents that came before you, right? Versus everything being as individualized as possible, to look at you as a unique human and say, what are your needs? How can we adapt and adopt things that are important to you? How can we bring some of your culture, your values, your system, your things that you've known as a young child into our world versus, okay, here's your bed, and now here are our rules, and now you're part of our family. You're one of us. Now you're a Smith, and the Smiths do it this way. It really negates the whole idea of belongingness and that connectedness that we often forget that children have. No matter what, they have connection, even in situations that are problematic or difficult. There were days where mama wasn't using. There are days where grandma was able to get up and help and do things and give you love and comfort. Maybe it wasn't as consistent as it needed to be, but to honor that and to be able to at least say, hey, I know you had some tough times. Talk to me about the good times too. I want to help you to live in a house where you can excel. What were the things that helped you to excel before? That we call that in social work a strengths perspective.
So, what advice would you give to foster parents to sort of navigate that?
The advice I would give is to ask, not assume that their lives were so horrible that they just don't even want to have anything to do with it, not assume that they don't have their own values, not assume that a child or a young person doesn't have a past and a history that's meaningful to them, even in the throes of difficult situations or loss and grief. And also to understand that just the nature of the move is traumatic, and to help minimize that trauma with a welcoming, open environment that says to the child, you are worthy, and what you bring to our family is as important as what we give back to you. Really valuing their experiences and asking those questions, what do you like to eat? What is it that you guys did on Friday nights? Did you just order pizza and hang out every Friday night? Or was it a night that the family split apart and everybody just kind of did their own thing? What are the things you're used to, and try to incorporate some of that into the family system that you're moving into.
Could you give me a sort of really good sample question that a foster parent could sort of bring out of their back pocket to ask a teenager to sort of help this process along?
I think the best question is, tell me, what are the things that you enjoy the most? What's an important culture or tradition that your family shared that I can help you to continue to live out in your life?
Yeah, those are very open-ended questions. I think that people would really appreciate them. Could you tell me about your childhood and upbringing?
Well, I had an interesting childhood. My father was military, so I moved around every 3 years my entire life until I got into high school. My parents were really good about making sure that we immersed ourselves in the community and the culture where we lived. So we would go and make sure we saw all the sites, all the milestones, all the places you needed to see in a certain community, and understand a little bit about that culture. But we moved every 3 years. I went to about 10 different schools. Interesting though, is that everybody else that I knew was doing the same thing. We never really lived off of a military post unless my father was in Vietnam or somewhere overseas. We would live periodically in the hometown that they were from, my parents were from. But overall, it was, I found it very interesting. I found it very exciting. I loved to move, but we did it as a family, and we did it very planfully. So that's a little bit different, right, than someone uprooting themselves from a home and never seeing, or not often seeing, the people that they left behind. We went as a family. We were very tight, very close family, because it was oftentimes just us.
Yeah, so you got your bachelor's degree in psychology in 1985. What did you do after that?
Whew, that was a long time ago, wasn't it? I got my bachelor's degree in 1985. You just told everyone how old I am. That's okay. I'm just teasing. So I started with the Department of Human Services. Back then, that's what it was called. Now it's Department of Children's Services. And I started out doing child abuse investigations, which was really interesting for me. It was a big eye opener. I had not been exposed to some of that level of abuse and neglect of children. It was a big shock. I didn't have like the most, I would say, isolated experience in childhood. We saw lots of things. We went to lots of places. We lived overseas. We were exposed to a lot of different cultures. I had not been exposed to that kind of child abuse. I worked with a lot of sexual abuse. At some point, I moved into a sex abuse investigative role. Back then, we had some kind of specialty programs where we would work with police departments, be assigned a detective, and we would work only sex abuse cases. And I did that for quite a while. That's tough to hear all the time, to hear about that kind of trauma with children and adolescents. So I think I did that for around 3 years, and it was just a lot, especially when you start having your own children. It kind of, what you want to have in the way of empathy gets a little bit challenged when you have children at home. But you also, I always try to remember this unconditional positive regard. Not that I accept or approve of someone's behavior, but we're all who we are because of our constructed realities and because of the experiences that we've had. We're only as good as the people behind us, right? And then what we choose to have different. But many times the families, the caregivers I worked with, were pretty traumatically abused themselves as children. So it's unfortunate that cycle continued over time, but that was part of why I think I kept doing what I did for quite some time.
So tell me how you recharged.
I talk a lot to students in their program about self-care. And that sounds like kind of an easy little thing. And when I actually said to a group of students not long ago, I'm not talking about, having an occasional bubble bath and meditating once in a while. You have to be very deliberate about how you're addressing the triggers that happen and your own transference as you're dealing with these traumatic situations. So for me, I didn't do a great job of it at first. I was getting really paranoid. I would go to the mall and think every kiddo that was walking around with a man had been abducted, and I had to really take a step back. And part of what I did, frankly, was leave the field for a couple years and then come back. That gave me a little time to recharge. And then I changed what I was doing some, went from child abuse work to foster care. Although it seems like that's all the same, at least when you're working, I think for me, when I was working with the children in foster care, I could help to mitigate some of the trauma and hopefully help those families to develop skills to help the children, so to speak. So that was nice. And adoption work was also kind of a relief in some ways. But then on the other side of the fence, I did a lot of things and still do, like hiking. I play tennis and I try to do sports, things that I enjoy, just anything that kind of helps me to rethink and recharge. It's really important, no matter who you are, even as a child in foster care, an adolescent, a foster family, certainly social workers and psychologists and folks out in the field who are doing the work. You have to find a way to recalibrate yourself, or this gets really hard on you.
So, when you returned to DCS in the 1990s, you started working with foster care and adoption cases. So, how did that differ from just working solely with abuse cases?
With those abuse cases, now it may be different now, but back in the day, you would be assigned a case, you're on call 24/7. We had beepers even that we would have to go out on calls. So there was always this heightened feeling of emergency or urgency. And midnight comes, I had two small children at home. At that time, at some point, my husband was working third shift. I would be in fear every night that beeper was going to go off, and I would have to figure out who was going to come over and stay with the children while I had to go out on calls. So there was always this urgency there. When I moved into foster care, you were able to kind of have a little bit of a better schedule, so to speak. You were still sometimes on call for those foster parents and those children. But if you were able to go do visits, if you were able to really keep that relationship, the urgent situations were less. So you didn't have that sense of urgency all the time. So that was part of it. And seeing the children reunite whenever it was appropriate, and hopefully more often than not, seeing them reunite with their families and seeing the families repairing and feeling healthier. Those were always really nice, good things to see. So it also helped regenerate you or energize you, so to speak. Sometimes you didn't see that in the abuse cases. You just saw the worst end of it all.
So, tell me what a typical day looked like while you worked as a caseworker.
In child abuse, often would come in the office in the morning and back before we had a centralized call system, now the department has a place like a centralized number that all child abuse went through. When I was there, we didn't. We had these referral forms and people would call all day with possible abuse cases or neglect cases, and we would assign them out. So if it was your day to take them, you might spend your whole day going to a school, interviewing a child, going to a home, tracking down a birth family, trying to put the pieces together to see if this was a warranted abuse case or not, interviewing children pretty regularly, oftentimes scheduling appointments. If there was a child sexual abuse, we had a specific doctor we used, and calling his office and trying to get the parent or caregiver to get that child over to the doctor. Contacting the police departments. Oftentimes they would come with us and do the interviews with the offenders, that type of thing. If you had to remove a child because of safety issues and there wasn't a family member that you could safely put the child with. Then you're dealing with finding a foster home. You're working then with the foster care side of the agency, asking them who's got an opening, where can we put this child? Is there an emergency placement? And unfortunately, that begins that whole process with a child of being bounced from one place to the next. You're going to their house, literally getting a trash bag, putting in as many clothes and things as you can think of, and carrying them in your car to a stranger's home. Those are really hard things for the child, obviously, for the parent. Even in the worst of situations, the parent doesn't want that to happen, usually. And for you as the worker, it's emotionally, taxing to have to do that. But that was the typical kind of day. And that would happen, several days of the week. It wasn't just a one-off. This was your day every day, pretty much. And then if you were on the on-call rotation, then you took the calls at night as well. So you're working in the day and you're taking the calls all night. Now, I think their system's a little different now, but that was way back, when I first started. When I moved into foster care, you could schedule visits with families. You were supposed to visit at least once a month to every child on your caseload. And when that caseload is manageable, that's great. But if you think about some of the caseloads being upwards of 100 children, that's physically impossible to do once a month. Even at 40 and 50 children, you can't get to everybody's house and go to the school meetings and make sure they're getting their needs met, make sure their medical visits are occurring, all those things that you have to do as a caseworker in that department for every single child. Some children might be placed pretty far away. Maybe it takes you an hour and a half to get to a home. You spend a couple hours at the home or an hour at the home. And then by the time you drive back, it's mid-afternoon. And so then, you have other things you have to do. And the higher the caseload, obviously the more complicated and difficult it becomes, because you end up having to make decisions about who you're going to go visit based on need versus just ensuring, that everybody's doing okay, or based on a triage type model, like what's the worst of the worst situations. And so a lot of children get kind of left out in that process.
What was the highest number of kids you ever had on your caseload?
So for me back then, I think at one point I probably had about 50 on my caseload. When, say, someone would leave the agency and we would have to take on cases. Today, I think it's even higher than that. My 50 or so would be temporary generally. After a while, someone would come in and we could sort of, reallocate cases. 30 or so was typical back then. I don't think people realize how high the caseloads are. That if you're trying to see a child at least once a month and your caseload is 50 or 60 even, and there are 22, 21 work days of the month, it's physically impossible to do it. It's not even that I don't want to do it. I don't think people realize how much paperwork and documentation is required on every single visit that you make. Every contact, every phone call has to be documented.
And you were telling me that you didn't even have a recorder or any way to record the meetings that you had with these children.
Yeah, back when I was doing child abuse work, one of the frustrating things was that the equipment wasn't even available for us. So we would have to go out and do these interviews, and we would have faulty recorders or not one at all. And then we were expected to go to the district attorney's office and give them a full rundown on how that, a forensic interview went, and not have anything to back that up. So a lot of it was based on, unfortunately, like your memory. I think it's improved probably over the years. I'm going to hope so anyway.
I'm definitely going to hope so too.
I do know a lot of my students, the students in our social work program are actually employees of the Department of Children's Services, and they do get training, and there's a lot more emphasis on like forensic interviewing and how you do that, which I think is great. We still seem to be missing the piece of when I hear all that really horrible stuff, how do I address it and how do I go home at night and not have to relive it in my head all the time? We call that vicarious or secondary trauma. I mean, that is very much a real thing. And I don't know I think maybe that's an area that we need to do some more work around.
When we first talked, you informed me that not all foster care caseworkers have a social work degree. Could you tell me about that a bit?
Oh, certainly. Many years ago, I think this probably is partly due to just pure need to have bodies and seats, to have people to do the work. The Department of Human Services did not require even a human services type degree. So social work, psychology, child and family studies, anything like that.
So, what kind of degrees would these people that didn't have, psychology, social work degrees, what did they have?
Yeah. Well, I'll be honest with you. I had a fellow co-worker who had an accounting degree. I had co-workers, criminal justice degree, which is, I think, probably within that realm at some point. Right now, there are people with history degrees doing the work, English degrees.
If you would like to reach out, please send an email to exfostervoice@gmail.com. If you'd like a question to be answered on the show, or just want to voice your opinion, send a short video attached to your email. Do you believe that foster care is traumatic for the kids in it? And if so, how and what aspects?
Unfortunately, I do believe it is. I don't think there's a better option. There may be better ways to do foster care and prepare foster parents. The biggest piece of the trauma, I feel like, maybe comes in the transition between moving from their birth home or their whatever their caregiving situation was into a foster home. And then if it happens that the child is removed and moved several times, you're really removing and removing and removing. Even though we don't call it a removal, we just call it a move from one foster home to the other. You're in essence doing that. You're packing them up and moving them to the next place. And just like we talked early on, they don't know what to expect from that family system. The fear of not knowing, the idea that they may or may not belong or have a sense of belonging. They may not be accepted. All of those things weigh on a child and adolescent, weigh on their sense of self-esteem and self-efficacy. And over time, that really erodes their sense of purpose and who they are, their identity. It's hard enough being like 15 or 16, right? Let alone being that without any anchor.
You told me in the past, teenagers in the foster system were sometimes institutionalized if they had nowhere else to go. You've dealt with that directly with Audrey.
Yes, I have dealt with that directly. And this again is many years ago. Tennessee was one of the top in the nation for institutionalized adolescents. There weren't a lot of support services. There weren't a lot of group homes and residential treatment programs or foster families, frankly, that wanted to or had the capacity to work with children or with adolescents, excuse me. So I had Audrey, and she was at that point in time the longest standing adolescent in a mental institution in the state of Tennessee. She had been there her entire pre-puberty to adolescence. And I think I started working with her at about age 14. Unfortunately, she had almost grown up in mental health facilities, partly because there weren't services available. Her family, it wasn't a situation where she was severely abused, but she had two parents who both had intellectual capacity issues and weren't able to care for her. And so she was in that setting for the best part of her adolescence and pre-puberty, unfortunately. I don't know the end story for Audrey. I don't know what happened to her after I actually left that county of service and started working in a different county. But I worked with her for about a year, and it was quite taxing and quite sad to be raised in an institution. It really changes a lot of who you are. And unfortunately, at that point in time, a lot of our young people were being placed in institutions versus in more community-based settings.
So, in this particular Nashville mental hospital, what were the conditions like there? Was it prepared to raise someone from, 12, 11 to an adult?
Yeah, I don't think they're prepared. Unfortunately, there were a lot of Audreys in that same placement, maybe not quite there as long as she had been. The unfortunate thing is, your nurses and the social workers become your parents. And some of those are stable, some of them are there for a long time, but oftentimes there's turnover. If you could imagine living, in a cinder block wall room, maybe with a roommate, in a twin bed, and that's almost all you've known as a child, older child, and adolescent. You're on a regiment, you get up at the same time, you go to bed at the same time. There is school there, so you have classes, you go to the cafeteria to eat. It is a very rigid system. So whenever a young person leaves that system, especially if they have been there, what we call institutionalized, if they have been there for so long that that is their way of life, it's very difficult to get back into a system where you're not told everything to do every moment, right? You're not in this strict routine.
Did she have any hobbies?
I don't recall, to be honest with you, Serena. I cannot remember if she had hobbies specifically. I feel like they did a lot of painting there. So she did do some crafts. She enjoyed crafts. I don't know if she enjoyed them just because that was part of the daily routine there. And that was a way to kind of, be busy and have something fun to do, or if she had a genuine interest. That would be a really good question. But I do know she did a lot of crafts and enjoyed that.
So when Audrey was in this mental hospital, did she ever leave? Did she ever go anywhere, do anything? Was she just in there all the time?
She got to the place where she could come and spend the weekends with her parents. I do remember her taking like paintings or different things home with her when she had the home visits. I would pick her up and take her places on passes. We would just check in with her and make sure things were okay. But overall, Audrey stayed at the institution. She was, schooled there. She was there 24/7 all the time, if you could imagine that. Frankly, Audrey did leave a couple different times. She absconded, and we'd have to find her. One time I came to work on a Monday, and Audrey was sitting on a bench in front of my office, and she had walked probably over the weekend at least 30 miles or more to get from the facility to my office.
So why did Audrey walk 30 miles to see you? Did she have something she had to tell you?
No, she just wanted to come and see me. I think it was just her. Audrey had some pretty serious mental health conditions, and I think it was just her way of thinking she could outreach. She left the facility on a Friday, and she got to me on a Monday, and I don't know what happened to her in between or where she slept or anything. I had to, obviously help her, get her some food, and then get her back to the institution. But she was just, I think, reaching out for something that she didn't have there. And maybe, I don't know, maybe something happened. Honestly, it's been so many years ago that my memory's a little bit faded about it. But I do have a very strong memory of pulling up to the office and seeing her sitting on the bench and thinking, oh my goodness, what is Audrey doing here? And what has happened?
Were you trying to find foster placements for Audrey? And if so, how did that go?
We did over time. It did not go well. I think partly because of her mental health conditions, it was really difficult for her to maintain in a home. She really wanted to go back to her parents. And she had other family, but they weren't able to give her everything that she needed to help her manage her mental health condition. So we did try. And back then, there wasn't a huge emphasis, unfortunately, on helping adolescents. A lot of adolescents were in institutional placements. That seemed to be the par for the course. The state got, the state of Tennessee had a lot of issues around that, and there were some legal battles about it. And they did a much better job of opening up residential treatment and group homes after that. As a matter of fact, as I'm sitting here talking to you and thinking, I feel like we may have tried her in a couple of group homes and it didn't work out for her. And she ended up back at the facility. Just, I don't know if it was just the complex needs that she had, partly probably that, partly because she had been in an institution for so long it was very difficult for her to assimilate into a different type of environment, unfortunately.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your story and for sharing Audrey's story. I think both are really powerful.
You're very welcome. I'm so happy that you are highlighting this and highlighting kind of what it means to be in foster care. I don't think that that is something described at the level in that lived experience, right? That's needed for people to understand the full depth of it.